This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together will comprise our lecture on Jae-Gwon Kim's article, What is Naturalized Epistemology? We'll begin the lecture with a brief biographical sketch of Dr. Kim. Then we'll turn to his positive and negative theses in the paper. The negative thesis consists in two arguments attempting to establish that Quine's epistemology is not an epistemology at all. In fact, it's not even a consistently conceived project. The first argument alleges that Quine's goal in the paper is to articulate a causal, descriptive account of belief formation that purges the discussion of all normative or evaluative terms or ideas. Since, by definition, epistemology is normative in nature, this renders Quine's alleged epistemology a non-normative non-epistemology. The second argument alleges that the project itself isn't successful precisely because it's internally inconsistent. Kim alleges that while Quine intends to purge his project of all reference to or dependence upon epistemic and evaluative terms, he in fact implicitly relies and must rely on epistemic and evaluative terms, if only in the attribution of belief or representational content to individuals within his psychology. As a result, Quine cannot purge his project of normative and evaluative terms, and hence the project is internally inconsistent with its own stated intent. What about the positive thesis? Well, the positive thesis is just an argument to the effect that traditional epistemology, as traditionally conceived, seems possible. Kim begins this argument with the assumption that we believe epistemic judgments are factual. That is, differences in judgments require differences in fact. So if we say that Jill's belief is justified, and we look at Johnny, and Johnny forms the same belief using the same process for the same reasons at the same time, then it makes no sense for us to say that Jill's belief is justified and Johnny's, created in an identical way, is not justified. There must be some difference between the two to warrant a different judgment with regard to justification. As a result, Kim suggests, we're committed to the notion that beliefs have justificational supervenience. That is, that what makes a belief justified is rooted in facts, either facts about its logical nature or facts about its generative history. Some facts must be relevant to our evaluation of these beliefs as either justified or unjustified as a result of our belief that epistemic judgments are factual. This is Dr. Jae-Gwon Kim. He was born in 1934. He taught at several institutions, but he ended his career as the William Herbert Perry Fonts Professor of Philosophy at Brown University. He passed in November of 2019, but he made numerous contributions to philosophy, especially in the topics of mental causation and supervenience. I had the privilege of meeting him once when he gave a lecture at the University of Rochester. I found him to be incredibly nice and unpretentious, and to have a remarkably clear mind. In this paper, Kim has both a positive and a negative thesis. He offers only a schematic version of the positive thesis, and only a schematic argument for it. In the negative, however, he wants to argue that the Quinean notion of epistemology is in fact not epistemology in any interesting sense of the word, and is not internally consistent. He presents a simple argument that Quine is not doing epistemology. Epistemology is fundamentally, essentially, a normative discipline, whereas the Quinean project is fundamentally and essentially anormative. In addition to his argument that Quine's epistemology is in fact not an epistemology, he wants to argue that Quine, contrary to Quine's own claims, actually envisions a normative psychology of science. That is, Kim wants to claim that Quine cannot make sense of belief attribution or representational attribution of any kind without the corresponding normative notions of rationality and coherence. As a result, Quine disavows the normative, and yet he nevertheless inconsistently engages in normative theorizing. In the positive, Kim wants to argue that one has reasons to suppose that the traditional normative discipline of epistemology is in fact a possible field of human inquiry, precisely because we believe that epistemic properties supervene. So let's look at this negative thesis. Why suppose epistemology is a normative enterprise? Well, as Kim sees it, justification is a central concept of our epistemological tradition. The justification, as it is understood in this tradition, is a normative concept, and in consequence, that epistemology itself is a normative inquiry whose principal aim is the systematic study of the conditions of justified belief. Descartes, as the progenitor or father of modern epistemology, views epistemology as having two projects: to identify the criterion by which we ought to regulate acceptance and rejection of beliefs, and to determine what we may be said to know according to those criterion. These projects have led, given that justification is the only straightforwardly normative term in our definition of knowledge, to the domination of contemporary epistemology by the concept of justification. Two foundational questions regarding justification have occupied epistemologists throughout the history of philosophy. What conditions must a belief meet if we are justified in accepting it as true, and what beliefs are we in fact justified in accepting? Indeed, Kim observes, the answer to question 1 cannot be stated without the use of normative or evaluative terms, i.e., using descriptive or naturalistic terms alone. Now, it remains unclear to me whether Kim's argument is best understood as a case of the fallacy of argumentum ad verecundiam, appeal to unqualified authority, or argumentum ad populum, appeal to the people, especially bandwagon, or some combination of both fallacies here. For instance, we've observed that Descartes and Plato both have an epistemology of judgments and not an epistemology of beliefs. And what remains clear is that nothing about the history of epistemology, from Descartes to the present, makes it more likely to be true that epistemology itself, not as historically practiced, but as a possible field of human inquiry, is a normative inquiry whose principal aim is the systematic study of the conditions of justified belief. What, for instance, will we make of Gettier cases and the call for a warrant clause? Nevertheless, Kim continues, in urging naturalized epistemology on us, Quine is not suggesting that we give up the Cartesian foundationalist solution and explore others within the same framework. Quine's proposal is more radical than that. He's asking us to set aside the entire framework of justification-centered epistemology. That is what's new in Quine's proposal. Quine is asking us to put in its place a purely descriptive, causal, nomological science of human cognition. Now, I can't help but say that this is a terrible misrepresentation of Quine, but I don't think we can hold Quine utterly blameless when it comes to Kim's misconstrual here. For instance, in Quine's paper, he does seem to have the intent of writing a postscript for logical positivism, and in the paper itself it does sometimes seem as if he's portraying the logical positivistic project as if it were coextensive with epistemology. However, when we step back and look at the larger scope of Quine's writings, we realize that Quine is a coherentist and clearly has an alternative theory of justification in writing out there. Moreover, if we're careful in examining the language of the paper, it's really difficult to interpret that language as forwarding a descriptive, causal, nomological account of belief formation, bereft of any interest in normative or justificational attributions. We'll continue our discussion of Kim's argument that Quine's epistemology is no epistemology at all in our next lecture module.